Welcome to the Startup of the Year podcast, where each episode we showcase exciting new companies from around the world. This podcast is produced by Established, creators of the Startup of the Year program. Established is focused on helping organizations with their innovation, startup, and communication strategies.
Welcome back to the Startup of the Year podcast. I'm your host, Frank Gruber, the co-founder and co-CEO of Established, co-founder of Established Ventures, and the team behind the Startup of the Year community and this very podcast. Thanks for being here. On this episode of the Startup of the Year podcast, I'm going to be talking to Roy Schwartz, who's the co-founder and CEO of Axios HQ. He's also led Axios, the media company, through multiple legs of fundraising. He's overseen strategy and business operations and launched Axios HQ out of the company as an internal communications platform to help teams communicate more effectively. They also had Axios, the media company, acquired by Cox, which is super exciting, and had a really nice windfall there. He's also served as an Emmy award-winning docuseries executive producer with Axios on HBO, and is the co-author of a new book that's doing magnificently out there. It's a bestseller. It's called Smart Brevity: The Power of Saying More with Less. So looking forward to talking to Roy here. He got his start at Politico, which is another media company. He was the chief revenue officer there. So lots of media background, lots of business background. Excited to talk to him shortly. But before we dive in, we always like to shine a light on startups in our community, in the Startup of Your community. So we're going to celebrate one here today. The one we're going to be talking about today is The Beans, which is a company that helps, believes everyone deserves a plan for their money. They build personalized visual financial plans and help you stick to them through positive, proactive messages. The Beans is a simple, effective way to manage your money and follow your passion. So you can learn more about The Beans by simply going to join-thebeans.io. Again, it's on the internet. Go to type in join, JOIN, / I guess it'd be just a dash, thebeans.io. Really interesting product, and hopefully it'll help you. All right, let's talk to Roy. Hi, Roy. Thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast. I'm very excited to talk to you about your work in the digital media space, and as an entrepreneur now of two very well-known media companies. Thank you so much for joining.
Oh, excited to be here, Frank. Thank you.
All right. So for our listeners that are unfamiliar, can you take us back just a little bit to your experience and how you got to where you are today? I know that's probably a long story, but based on your background, you probably can make it pretty brief.
I should be able to do the Smart Brevity version, right? I joined Politico probably about a year after it was founded. It was about 50, 60 people at the time. And then Jim and I continued to grow that company. We took it to Europe, expanded it, and added Politico Pro. And then in 2016, we decided to launch our own company, Axios, and we launched that in 2017. It was publicly launched. And that was a huge success. Just recently got acquired by Cox Enterprise for just over $500 million. And then we just spun out another company called Axios HQ, which is in the communication software space. So that's the Smart Brevity version of where we are today.
I love it. Congratulations on the acquisition and everything, all your success with the company. It's really changed the way people communicate.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, so let's dive in here. So your new book, came out in September, is Smart Brevity: The Power of Saying More with Less. So wanted to share a little bit more about why you wrote the book and maybe what people should gather from it.
Yeah, so we developed Smart Brevity. So when we started Axios, we realized the biggest problem was that everyone was overwhelmed with information. You got text messages and email and fake news and real news. And we realized that we needed a new format in order for people to understand essential communication. In the first use case, it was all about news. But as we started to see how it could be applied to companies, and we started the SaaS company, we realized that there was actually a communication crisis that was taking place and that essential communication was getting lost. And so Smart Brevity, both the book and the format that we've created, it helps you figure out, okay, how do I actually create that essential communication? How do I format it? How do I make it so that it's easy to read and understand and ultimately engage the audience? And so that has been something that we thought would be a great book, but it's also been a great company, right? We've launched this SaaS company that helps over 400 different organizations utilize Smart Brevity for communication.
Excellent. So talk to me a little bit more about the company. So it's Axios HQ, is that correct?
Yeah, so Axios HQ, it's a SaaS company. We developed what we call an essential communication management platform, and it helps you figure out what you should send, when you should send it, how to engage the audience. We have an AI component that helps you write the content itself using all of the things that we've learned from Smart Brevity. So it's basically, if you took the book and built an AI model around it, that's what we've done.
Very cool. And we'll have to check that out. Where would they find that if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more, just go to axioshq.com.
Okay, great. All right. So for our listeners, we're going to dive back into the book itself so they get a sense of what this means. Can you give us just a little bit more about what Smart Brevity means and how do you approach it?
Yeah, so first and foremost, it is thinking about how do I communicate essential information in the most effective, efficient way possible. And there are lots of rules that we've found that are helpful when our writers are writing content for the news side. And we've taken those and seen which ones apply to business, and then that's what's in the book. So a good example is most people sit down in front of a keyboard and just start writing. And most of the time they're thinking about, well, what is it that I want to communicate? They don't spend the time and the effort to format it in a way that the reader wants to absorb it. So you end up usually with long blocks of text, not organized, and not really written for the reader, but written more for the writer. And so that's the first issue that we identify in the book, and we try and help people think through, which is be audience first. Think about who's going to read it, what they need to know, and try and be as efficient as possible for their sake.
That makes sense. And it's interesting in this time of like social media and me economy and everything else to reposition everything towards the audience versus yourself, right? So that's interesting. And then, so I guess if somebody wanted to dive in there and was struggling with brevity to begin with, I think even it said in the book that you guys struggled with it to begin with because you're all background or most of the backgrounds were journalism backgrounds.
Yep.
How did you rewire your brain to think, this way?
Yeah, you start to see the results, right? So we were experimenting with it, and very quickly we saw that when we were writing in this style, people were just engaging with it more. And so, we sort of doubled down and explored what makes sense. And, as you look at how things are formatted, right? Most people think that they read, but they don't. They actually scan. And so how do you more effectively scan information? And so a big thing is break up those blocks of text, right? Use bullet points, use bolding effectively. We use what we call axioms. So we kind of tell you what's going to be in that paragraph. So it might be by the numbers, go deeper, why it matters. But we help orient you as you're scanning through content. And the reward is that people read the content, engage with the content, and that way what you're trying to communicate is more effective.
That makes sense. So with this, the first sentence or those first words that you utter, if you're speaking, or maybe the subject line of your email are pretty darn important. How do you approach the importance of those, and what are some tips maybe for making sure that you nail it?
Yeah, I mean, one tip is most people start with the subject line. I wouldn't. You should write what you're going to write, then read it out loud so that you can see if it makes sense. And a lot of people use words in their communication that they would never use in real life. My favorite example is people will write aforementioned, right? You and I would never say that, yet in writing, it seems acceptable. And so a tip that we have in there is whatever you've written, read it out loud, see if it's how you would communicate in real life. And then second, take that and then form what is the subject line, right? It should be 4 or 5 words that describe what you're trying to say. Ideally, be as punchy as possible. By punchy, I mean use 1 or 2 syllables as opposed to 3 or 4 syllables. It's almost, you want to, take a thesaurus and use it backwards, right? Like what is the simplest, most efficient word that you can use, not what is the most complicated word that you can use.
That's interesting because a lot of people try to, use complicated, more larger, more verbose words to, in writing, because it makes them think, or they maybe think that it makes them sound smarter, right?
No, that's exactly the problem, Frank, is a lot of people use things in writing that they wouldn't use in real life,
Right.
because they want to seem like subject matter experts, or they want to seem like, they got a great education.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, it's not really effective. The most effective words are actually the shorter one syllable words. And if you can use those, they tend to be more memorable as well.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, some of the best curse words are very punchy, and effective, right? And in some cases,
That's right.
And it makes sense why they are. But to be more jumping back in here, so it's interesting coming from. We used to had a media company as well, and Tech.co, and you guys have done this for a while as well, and you're kind of taught to like write longer formatted things, just because it'll get people's attention. You're gaining more engagement. Not to mention, the bots love it, right? From an SEO perspective, if you're trying to optimize your site. So of course, everything's pointing towards this like longer format, and you guys were kind of starting to do the opposite. So obviously, that's a big innovation from like a shift, right, in people's thought process. So
Yeah.
I think, I mean, did it take you a while to get to that, where you all came to the point where like, well, I mean, I guess what was the point that you're like, yeah, we need to do this, we need to go against all the grain of like what we've been doing forever,
It's you look at the data and it's pretty, remarkable, right?
Mhm.
So at news organizations, 80% of people drop after the first 250 to 350 words. Now, think about that if you were doing Game of Thrones, right? And
Right.
people dropped after the first 15 minutes. You wouldn't be able to produce the rest of the show, right?
Right.
And so, in news, it's sort of this weird thing where, writers are writing mainly for themselves, and they're writing, 1,000 words because that's what they've done forever and a day. And unfortunately, most articles, 80% of people drop after the first 250, 350 words. So if you wanted to actually share information, you're trying to be most efficient about what people learn from what you wrote, you would put it in those first 250 words. Most of the time, people are trying to actually bury their stuff because they're like, I want them to read to the end. But that's unfortunately not the reality that we live in.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't even think about that. You're right. And even like, I remember you were talking about a report in the book or reports in the book from, I think, the CIA, where they're literally like not even putting the point into the report because they just buried it like so deep that you can't even get the point that was most interesting. But if you ask those same people, they could tell you in a second what it is, right? So
yeah, the idea in the book was, if you went to a researcher, you went to a person that just, uncovered something, you say, oh, what was the most interesting thing? They could easily tell you what that is. But then you put that in an email, you put it in a report, and all of a sudden you're desperately searching through thousands of words and pages upon pages to figure out what was the point of this report that you're reading.
Right.
And so what we're saying is turn that upside down. You first convey what it is that you're trying to say and why it's important. And then if people want to go deeper, yes, that content should be there and people should be able to go deeper if they want to. But if you can't convey the most essential information, then you've already lost that audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to jump in with our audience's startup audience, and I wanted to find out, how can this be applied to startups, right? You guys probably had to do pitch decks and things and presentations, I'm assuming, at some point. And what's a better way of doing that? How can you apply Smart Brevity to that?
Yeah, I'll start with this is how we run the entire company. So we do once a week updates for every single division and every piece of essential communication. So I get, for example, a sales update, a marketing update, a finance update. Every department, I get an update once a week of the most important things in hierarchical order. And so that's extremely helpful for me in running a company because I can keep track of, multiple things because it's being sort of created in an easy to consume way. And it's made my one-on-ones far more valuable, right? Because I don't have to spend the time getting basic information. I've already read that. I can go deeper and really sort of, strategize with the executive team. We also are really transparent, and I think most startups are pretty transparent. So we share those updates with that entire team. So the sales update that goes to the team goes to me and also goes to the entire executive team. So if you ever wanted to know where product or marketing or HR are with anything, you can pull up their last week's update and you'd know where it is. So I think that one piece is you can really run your company using essential communication as a foundation and using smart brevity as a foundation. In terms of pitch decks, the mistake that we see people make, and we have an entire chapter in the book dedicated to presentations, is that they are using far too many words. And so oftentimes, a presentation should be a supplement to a story that you're telling, but it shouldn't be the story. And the issue is that if you have too many words on a page, the human brain just can't comprehend reading and listening and interpreting the image all at the same time. So our advice is pick a really powerful image, only pick a few words, and then tell the story verbally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I've done pitch coaching, and actually just did a webinar recently with our community about pitching, and trying to get that down to a lower number of slides. 10 would be great. If you can get it up, around 10
That's
to
right.
12 is good. You can always put things in an appendix and talk about it later. Like, you don't have to put it all out there right away. So yeah, kind of teasing with it, and then obviously get to the point more quickly. I love that. Okay, so that's really interesting. I mean, I heard that you were using smart brevity for your internal communications, but I didn't understand what that means. But it sounds like you basically have the software, and if anyone gets your software, you can use it externally and internally. Is that correct? Or is there levels?
That's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So our best use cases is when a company will take it, use it for department updates and all hand updates, and then also use it for client communication for things like product updates.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I'm curious, are there any like recent like companies that you think of that you're like, oh gosh, they're doing a great job leveraging this new system?
There are several that we're really excited about in terms of how they use it, and we've done several events. So, Weight Watchers, which is now WW, is a good example. They came on pretty early. They're using it across several different departments, and we recently had them at a public event talking about the power of smart brevity within their organization. But it's exciting to see how quickly it catches on. So we now have over 400 clients, and the average client has 3 different use cases.
Wow.
And so, you can imagine the ones that have been with us for a while have, maybe 10 or 20 different use cases.
Interesting. So this format could replace the regular emails that you would get. And I mean, does it replace something like a Slack? I mean, do you still use Slack? Do you need Slack?
Oh, no. We love Slack. We use it a lot. I think what Slack solved was instant communication, right? And so if you think about email in the middle and Slack in terms of instant, we're trying to solve essential communication, which is sort of the flip side of instant communication. And I think Slack and Teams did a great job of organizing your instant communication into channels and just making it easier to do. And then essential communications has that same issue, right? You've got to take it out of email. You've got to format it differently. You've got to make it easier to search and have analytics on it. And so it's just a different beast than a standard email, but it's treated the same. So I bet, right now, Frank, you probably have 300 plus emails sitting in your inbox that you received today.
Right.
And, you're trying to sort through what are the most important ones. Well, if the most important ones were formatted differently, looked differently, then you'd have a much easier job in terms of finding that essential communication.
Right. That makes sense. I do also like to read the Axios emails too. So those obviously bubble to the top. So thanks for putting those out and keeping us on point with what's going on in the world. All right. So let's talk about how you can kind of apply this to social media too, because that's its own certain platforms, or most platforms have brevity built in some ways. But what's the best way to leverage the principles behind it to maybe get your social media to go further, be read better, have a better take?
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting part, right? That, Twitter obviously has brevity built in, but so does Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. You can only see a certain amount of information on one screen of your phone. And so how do you, take advantage of that one screen? And I think we help people write better subject lines. That subject line concept can be used for a headline, right? And then we have an entire section in the book all about image selection and thinking through what's the best image to use. So it takes a little bit of effort in terms of thinking about what is that subject line or headline that's going to be punchy, again, using 1 or 2 syllable words, and capturing the thought, and then what's going to be visible, right? And each format's a little bit different, and you have to think about who's on Twitter versus who's on Instagram, and what are they going to respond to, especially in terms of the media, the image selection. But ultimately, the concepts around smart brevity are going to translate extremely effectively to anything on the internet, and especially on social media.
That makes sense. And then, what about speaking? You talked about presentations. You talked about, pitch decks, as far as things you can do. Public speaking is something that we all have to do at some point, right? And so can you share a little bit more about how this can be applied to speaking out in public as well?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is that it really forces you to think about what you're going to say and the way in which you outline what you're going to speak about or what you're going to convey in written form, right? The whole concept of smart brevity is, what is it you're trying to say and what's the most effective way to say it? So when it comes to speech writing, that really helps you organize your thoughts. The other thing about speech writing that we found most effective is it's really hard for the human mind to comprehend more than one big thing. And so tell them what that one big thing is at the beginning, go through and reinforce it through your speech, and then bring it back around at the end. If you think about it, the success of TED Talks kind of shows you that short form, one topic can be really effective. And so I think shorter is better. It tends to be more memorable. And if you can convey one big idea, that's the way to go.
Great. And I remember reading that you basically say, don't be cute, don't be, ironic, don't be comedy doesn't necessarily go well in some of the written forms. I'm curious, though, how can you get, let's say you're a comedian and you want to use smart brevity. How would you do that? Is there a way to do that? Or is it just not?
Well, I think what we say is let your personality shine through, right?
Right.
I think if you are a funny person and you tend to, be able to get people to laugh, you should absolutely use that. It's more that we see people try and do things that they're not naturally talented in, and then it falls flat, and then it makes them nervous, and then it sort of, unfortunately, makes them perform worse.
Right.
It's stick to your personality, both in writing and in when you're giving a speech. Mm-hmm. If you're not a funny person, then it's hard to lean into that. But if you are, then you should absolutely use it. So if you're a comedian, have at it.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, thank you for the clarification there. So let's see. Let's dive into a little bit more about this. Is great info about the book and how to leverage smart brevity. But I wanted to learn more about your background, because this is a podcast of entrepreneurs and founders. Can you talk a little bit more about what it was like starting Axios, and maybe a little bit about that journey? Because I'm assuming, I don't know the story, so I'd love to hear it. And then obviously if there's any tips or things you've learned along the way.
Sure. So we created Axios because I think two things. One is we saw a real problem that wasn't being solved, and I think that drives entrepreneurs. And we wanted to really own the company. So having equity and being able to share that equity with your employees, that's really important. And so when we created Axios, we gave everyone options in the company. And of course, now that we've had an exit, people can share in the growth of the company, which has been very exciting. In terms of the journey, the first few years, they're really hard work. They're a lot of fun. It's the typical startup story. We were in it wasn't a WeWork, but it was like a WeWork in Arlington, Virginia. We had, started off with 5 people in a room, and, very quickly, grew to 100 people. We eventually got kicked out of that space. They basically were like, you've taken over too many offices here, and this is kind of becoming your headquarters. So, you maybe time for you to leave and get your own space. And it's been a learning journey, right? How do you build a company? How do you set up things like benefits and all the rest of it? But it's been a lot of fun.
What was the biggest challenge for y'all?
I think the biggest challenge has been the last few years. If you didn't have a real culture, right? If you weren't a company that had a real vision and a real mission beyond profitability, you were going to hit a lot of challenges, especially with COVID and just the way in which I think the employee base has changed over the last few years. And we were very fortunate that we, got ahead of it because we'd seen that culture was so critical as you're building a company. And so when we created Axios, we spent a lot of time on the front end thinking about, well, what's that culture going to be and what's it going to stand for? And what does candor mean for us and what does excellence mean? And so all that time that we spent up front, I think really paid off for us, especially when COVID hit and you were dealing with a lot of uncertainty. The fact that we had a lot of trust from our employees went a long way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Did you focus early on culture, or was it something that you just started focusing on once you had to think about it, once they're at a certain size?
No, that was day one. We spent so much time up front that I think that's where it really paid off for us. We weren't trying to catch up, during COVID.
Right.
We had gone ahead of it. We were also fortunate that we were remote first, kind of to begin with. Even though we had a headquarters and a lot of people were here in DC, we had made a decision early on to hire our tech talent across the country. And so we already had Zoom and Slack and other things in place that made the transition more simple.
No, that makes sense. Okay, so obviously today we've got an election coming up, and you guys have probably tackled a bunch of those. Is there anything that you have to be careful of with putting information out there that you think of now that you maybe didn't think about before? Anything learned along the way as you were doing this in that regard?
Look, I think all companies are facing the reality that they're probably going to have to be more public on lots of different topics. Employees are going to want to know, well, where do you stand on these issues? And in the past, I think you could, get away with not talking about them or, trying to separate work from those issues. But I think that's going to be really difficult. It's already proven to be really hard. And so companies should really think about what issues are near and dear to their hearts, what makes sense to take a stand on, or at least to be made public, versus, what are you gonna, decide not to comment on. You got to get ahead of it. People have to think about it. You can't ignore it. And the other part is you got to have a place for employees to be able to bring those things up. And so we found, the town hall style meeting about various things that have popped up throughout the years have been really powerful because people can share their thoughts and, hear about how other people are feeling about things. And that has been, really helpful.
Yeah, it makes sense. You're definitely right. It sounds like you already live kind of in a transparent setup already, which makes it super helpful and obviously a model for others to follow.
Yeah, I think, look, most modern companies are pretty transparent and they kind of have to be, right? I think that the days of sort of, lots of closed door meetings, that's going to be really tough, I think, to keep going. I think employees want to know more, and I think companies are going to have to share more.
Right. No, that makes sense. All right. So in true smart brevity, format here, if there's one thing you would want our listeners to gather from this interview, if they maybe didn't hear everything else you said, what would it be?
It would just be that communications is more critical than it's ever been before. And if your head of communication doesn't have a seat at the table, or if you don't think about communication and you're running a company, you've got to change that immediately, because communication is how strategy and execution actually, take place in the real world. And so you've got to be thinking about how you're communicating your message internally and externally. It's got to be a huge part of your strategy.
Absolutely. All right. So where would people find your book? Where should they go get it? What's the best place?
You can get it anywhere that you like to buy books. So whether that's Amazon, your local bookstore, Barnes & Noble, it is available across the country. And should be pretty easy to order. It's been on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list, I think, for 6 weeks in a row now. So that's been pretty exciting.
Congrats. That's awesome.
And I hope people enjoy it.
Congratulations. That's amazing. You also get the audiobook too. I actually listened to the audiobook and have the other version as well. So I appreciate the audiobook being out there as well and doing that for everyone. All right. Thanks so much, Roy. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us today. This was really helpful. And hopefully we got some others that are listening that will be able to leverage your information to make their companies better.
That's great. Really enjoyed doing this and look forward to checking in the future as well.
I loved catching up with Roy. I know that conversation really resonated with me because, communication is such a big part of life and everything you do, both professionally and personally. And there's just so much you can learn to tighten it up and be more direct. So I love that. I think everyone could probably benefit from this. So if you are listening, you should share this because I think somebody's going to find it helpful. So get out there and share this with somebody you think might find it helpful because we believe in sharing and sharing is caring. And hopefully somebody can be a little more brief. All right, speaking of being brief, before we wrap, I've got a few things to say, and then we're going to wrap this puppy up. Trying to be super tight today and on theme. All right, there's an event coming up. You should be there. It's a virtual event, December 13th, a little bit before the holidays here. It's going to be great. The event is free, and it'll feature 5 startups from our community. They're all going to be featured and pitching for a set of investor judges, which are really great too. So some great companies, some great people involved, and I'm super pumped about this pitch event that'll kind of round out our year and fast track a couple companies to our upcoming summit, which we'll announce soon. So go over to register and be a part of it. You can come and attend and see what companies are out there and learn a little bit about the pitch because they're going to be getting some feedback from these judges. So go to soty.link/grow pitch2022, soty.link/grow pitch2022, and join us on December 13th. I will see you there. All right, well, that's the show for today. Thanks for listening. And as always, if you have a startup idea and you want to get it going, today is the best day to start up. Not tomorrow, not the next day. Get it going. Start, for crying out loud. Get it going, and you can build upon that. You can do it incrementally. So get it going, get it started. And in doing so, I encourage you to join our community for access to support, expert advice, and some resources you might need to elevate your startup by simply going to startupofyear.com or soty.link/apply. And until next time, I'm Frank Gruber. Don't forget to hug your loved ones and hope you have a wonderful and safe holiday season. Good luck out there starting up.
Thanks for listening to the Startup of the Year podcast. Be sure to subscribe and we'll be back with another episode soon.